Welcome back to CENEDL. Croeso nôl. This is the second in a series of podcasts tracing the history of Wales. My name is Stephen Mason, and in this podcast we'll be looking at the prehistory of Wales and the story of the Red Lady of Paviland cave. So why start a history podcast with prehistory? Well, if there's one thing that's often missing from your history lessons, it's context. Even though the nation of Wales didn't exist 1,000,000 years ago, or even 20,000 years ago, I think it's important, as Dylan Thomas once famously said,
to begin at the beginning.
Archaeologists can help us tell the story of who we are and where we came from, and they can often do it in a way that some historians, for whatever reasons, might be reluctant to follow. For example, I was surprised, but pleased, to hear the BBC presenter and archaeologist Neil Oliver describe 5th century Scotland like this.
Back in the 5th century, this is what Scotland looked like. A patchwork of disparate ethnic groups. Welsh-speaking tribes called the Britons lived along the River Clyde and the south.
That's right. Neil Oliver describes the people living in 5th century Scotland as Welsh speakers, and during the same period of history there were Welsh speakers throughout what we now call England. But that's another story for another video. But as far as the beginning of present-day Wales is concerned, our story starts in a cave in southern Wales. In 1823, Oxford University paleontologist William Buckland was removing fossils from the Goat's Hole Cave on the Gower peninsula in southern Wales. While doing so, Buckland came across the remains of a skeleton buried with ivory rods, shell beads and other ornaments. Both rods and shells were stained superficially red and lay in the same red substance that enveloped the bones. The ivory jewellery would have come from the now extinct woolly mammoth, a creature that some scientists in Russia today are trying to clone back from extinction to help fight 21st century climate change in that country.
Это хобот малоляховского мамонта, которого мы раскопали в 2013 году.
And do you know how old this is?
28 тысяч.
Cloning woolly mammoths. Anyway, back to the Red Lady. Having discovered the skeleton, the Oxford University professor wrongly concluded that the remains he had found belonged to a Roman-era witch or prostitute, and hence the discovery became known as the Red Lady of Paviland Cave, Dynes Goch o Gof Penavai. However, later experts, using better technology, and not using the story of Noah as a basis for dating historical artifacts, have identified the bones as the remains of a male youth buried ceremonially in the cave as long ago as 28,000 years, or maybe even 33,000 years ago. The male youth was about 25 to 30 years old, and was a human who probably inhabited the caves of the present-day Gower Peninsula, during a time when much of Britain was encased in ice and seemingly uninhabitable for part of that time. This period of European history, around 30 to 50,000 years ago, is referred to as the Middle to Upper Paleolithic transition. This is when the first modern-looking humans arrived in Europe from Africa, and the last Neanderthal humans who had lived in Europe for millennia vanished. According to John Davies, in A History of Wales, the care taken in interring the bones and the red ochre with which they were coloured suggest that they received a ritual burial, with the soul of the Red Lady being entrusted to the gods, or more likely goddesses, of his people. So that's the story of the Red Lady of Paviland Cave, the site of the oldest known ceremonial burial in Western Europe. Please join me in the next podcast when we'll learn what happened when the ice sheet over Wales and Britain receded. Hwyl am y tro, Heddwch.
A census taker once tried to test me. I ate his liver with some fava beans and a nice Chianti.